history was made. For the first time since Defense Minister Molotov landed in Britain in a Tupolev SB-2 in 1941, Soviet combat aircraft were about to touch down on British soil. However, far from being an act of aggression, this was an extraordinary example of Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost in action, but in the most dramatic way. As well as establishing a new Soviet desire to market its defense products more widely. What made the visit all the more incredible was the fact that the aircraft that landed on that cloudy afternoon were far removed from the somewhat crude designs that the West had come to know from Korea and Vietnam. The MiG-29 single-seater and the MiG-29UB combat trainer, given the name Fulcrum by NATO, amazed the crowds at the Farnborough Air Show with their stunning tail slides and knife-edge passes. For the first time, Western analysts had a long overdue chance to evaluate the performance of the Soviets' latest fighter aircraft. There was a widespread belief that the best that Soviet engineers could do was to plagiarize Western designs. They were unnerved to discover that far from lagging behind the West in both technology and design philosophy, the Mikoyan Design Bureau in Moscow had come up with a formidable aircraft that could possibly be considered the best air combat and multi-role fighter in the world. At least as maneuverable as the American F-16, and better at high angles of attack, it can fly at Mach 2.2, but land on shorter, rougher airstrips than any Western equivalent. But for glasnost, this would have been a terrifying thought. Even so, the fact that in the past MiG jets have flown with around 40 air forces throughout the world, including North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, India, Iraq, and former Yugoslavia, gives cause for concern and makes it understandable why Allied forces were so keen to keep enemy aircraft firmly on the ground during the Gulf War and more recently in Bosnia. The MiG-29 has once again brought to the forefront a name which has always been synonymous in Western minds with the ferocious evil of the Communist Empire. Ever since Korea in the 1950s, when the performance of the MiG-15 came as a surprise to American pilots, the designs of the Mikoyan Design Bureau have been taken very seriously. But the story of their development goes back to before the Second World War. Stalin saw the need to develop an effective combat aircraft industry in preparation for what he knew would be a threat from the Nazi government in Berlin. Experience in the Spanish Civil War had shown that the Soviet-built E-15 and E-16 were no match for Franco's German Messerschmitts in terms of speed and altitude. If Russia was to be effectively defended through the next decade, something better was needed. In February of 1939, Stalin, through Molotov, his defense minister, brought together the best Soviet design talent, among them Yakovlev, Tupolev, Lavochkin, and two designers who would team up to form the Mikoyan Design Bureau, Artem I. Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurievich. As a direct response to the problem in hand, their bureau took on the motto, speed and altitude. By 1940, the MiG team had come up with its first design concepts, the I-61 and I-65. They both featured a water-cooled piston engine and a small, aerodynamically shaped frontal area, which produced less drag and higher speed in flight. The prototype was transferred to the assembly lines in February of 1940 and became the first Mikoyan Gurievich plane to be put into production. Designated the MiG-1, it featured a Mikulin AM-35 piston engine. Arkady Ikatov, the first ever MiG test pilot, flew the plane to a new Soviet speed record of 527 miles per hour, making it the fastest interceptor of the period faster even than the Supermarine Spitfire. The design brief for an aircraft that could intercept and repel German bombers at high altitude, as well as adequately engage fighters nearer the ground, had been achieved. However, the MiG-1 proved to be susceptible to battle damage, and only 100 were built before it was superseded by the strengthened and aerodynamically refined MiG-3. The use of new phenol-impregnated woods made the MiG-3 a very sturdy machine, which excelled at high altitude and could sustain quite heavy machine gun fire. Its survivability was demonstrated by Junior Lieutenant Lukianov when he returned his MiG-3 safely to its base after ramming a Junkers 88, cutting off its tail. The modular design enabled quick, easy and cheap construction, and by mid-1941 the factories were turning out 25 to 28 aircraft every day. However, on the 22nd of June 1941, a German attack took the Soviets by surprise. 70% of its air force were concentrated on 60 airfields, well within the range of the Luftwaffe. They were neither dispersed or concealed and had no radar warning. German reports claimed that 1,200 aircraft had been destroyed by lunchtime and a further 600 by nightfall of the first day. Almost 4,000 planes had been destroyed by the middle of that week, many of them brand new MiGs, Yaks and Lags. On the 27th of June, the decision was taken to form 6 new air defense regiments equipped with MiG-3s. The planes soon proved themselves in an air defense role, especially against high-flying bombers. Along with new aircraft from the Yakovlev and Lavochkin design bureaus, the MiGs played a major role in the defense of Moscow, often flying from rough, unmade and perilously short runways, and being equipped with bombs mounted on the wings to attack tanks and motorized troops. They excelled at high altitude, knocking 900 Nazi bombers out of the Moscow skies in the first 6 months of the war, but generally came unstuck when faced with the better flown and better armed Messerschmitts in dogfights at lower level. Development continued throughout the war, and new, more powerful engines were put to use in these I-220 and I-224 prototypes, the latter gaining the record for the greatest altitude for a fighter at that time. This I-222 prototype featured the first pressurized cockpit, making even higher altitudes a possibility. But the aim now was for speed, and it was quickly realized that the piston engine and propeller combination had already reached its speed limit of about 500 miles per hour. A new form of propulsion had to be found. Mikoyan had been working on axial flow turbojets as early as 1938, but development had been halted at the start of the war in favor of projects that would produce quick results. Now, these efforts were renewed. A first step towards a fully jet-propelled aircraft was the I-250 prototype, featuring a piston engine that powered both a conventional propeller and a compressor that fed air to a combustion chamber and nozzle in the tail. A small batch of these planes saw service in naval aviation as the MiG-13. Another early development was the Utka, or Duck, a 3-seater experimental aircraft which, despite its ungainly looks, was a precursor for later swept-wing design. The wing took its shape from that of an arrowhead. It had a tricycle arrangement undercarriage and an M11 engine in a pusher configuration. It had an unusual canard wing as a forward stabilizer, with vertical stabilizers mounted on the wings. Test flights by A.N. Grinchik proved the major advantage of this aerodynamic configuration: safe flight at high angles of attack. None of these concepts saw any serious use during the war. Unlike the British and Germans, the Soviets were unable to produce a true jet aircraft before the end of hostilities. With the war now over, the Soviets had no time to rest on their laurels. Defense of their now enlarged country was a priority, and the lessons learned over Moscow and on the Eastern Front proved that air superiority was the name of the game. The rest of the world was moving quickly into the jet age, and the Soviets needed to compete on equal terms. With the help of an influx of German and Austrian engineers, and borrowing heavily from German designs, the bureaus worked towards a fully jet-powered fighter. Mikoyan's first prototype had its maiden flight on the 24th of April, 1946. An impressive straight-wing design, it had a divided nose air intake feeding two German BMW turbojets. It went into production as the MiG-9 and thus became the first Soviet jet fighter to fly. It was armed with a 37 and two 23mm Nudelmann cannon. It had a top speed of 565 miles per hour and a ceiling of 42,000 feet, and featured the pressurized cockpit seen in the I-222 prototype, as well as air brakes, a tricycle nose-wheel undercarriage, and an ejector seat. In fact, it was the first Soviet jet to be abandoned in mid-air. But it was certainly not the last. The effectiveness of this ejector seat was demonstrated using dummies in a MiG-21. This pilot was brave enough to demonstrate it for real. And it proved its worth in this accident, involving a Yak Forger vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Even the MiG-29 is not immune from accidents. The life of Anatoly Kvorchul was saved by his ejector seat at Le Bourget in 1989. After this first rush into the jet age, there was a need for more sophisticated designs and more powerful engines. These could be designed in Russia given time, but they were needed now and already existed in Britain and America. Stalin was reported to have asked, "Who would be so stupid as to let us have their engines?" Britain's Labour government duly provided 40 Rolls-Royce Derwents and 25 Neens in late 1946. In March of 1946, the bureaus were given the task of producing a high-altitude, clear-weather interceptor to replace the MiG-9. They were to use the new British engines, which were twice as powerful as the ex-German units. In contrast to its competitors, the MiG Bureau came up with a design that was quite revolutionary. This I-270 experimental interceptor first flew in late '46. It used a two-chamber liquid rocket motor producing 3,400 pounds of thrust. This power, which remained constant at altitude, enabled high speeds, high rate of climb, and a high ceiling, features which were to remain with all later MiG designs. For the first time, it used a slender swept wing with a stable roll profile and a T-shaped tail. These early prototypes were such an advance on anything that the Soviets or the Germans had produced before, that Mikoyan and Gurevich received the Stalin Prize for 1947, worth 150,000 rubles to each. In the spring of 1948, it was ordered into production as the MiG-15. It had a 45-degree swept wing, a maximum speed of 652 miles per hour, and a service ceiling of 50,000 feet. It retained the MiG-9's 37 and two 23mm cannon. It was simple and strong. It could fly from unmade and grass airfields and had a short takeoff run. It was of modular design and could be easily assembled and maintained. A four-man crew could replace an engine in an hour and a wing in 25 minutes. Some 18,000 were produced and eventually served with almost 30 air forces throughout the world. In 1950, it was brought in to replace the aging piston engine aircraft that had made up the North Korean Air Force. Its performance came as a great surprise to American pilots flying straight-winged F-80 Shooting Stars and aging Mustangs. It was faster, higher, more maneuverable, and with greater firepower. America quickly retaliated by introducing the new F-86 Sabre. This was America's second-generation jet fighter and could compete on more even terms. Even so, the MiG could climb twice as fast and to a greater height, and could survive a heavy onslaught from the Sabre's 6 machine guns. The lessons learnt in Korea were incorporated into the I-330 prototype. It first flew on the 13th of January 1950 and went into production as the MiG-17 in 1952, too late to play a part in Korea. It was larger than the MiG-15, but with its new afterburning engine and 45-degree swept wings, it could fly faster at 711 miles per hour and higher at 54,500 feet. In the hands of test pilot Ivachenko, it even managed to break the sound barrier during a dive. It was the Soviets' first transonic fighter. The MiG-15 had always had a dangerous tendency to snap roll into an uncontrollable spin during a high-speed turn. Many of the changes incorporated in the MiG-17 were designed to overcome these problems of handling and stability at high speeds. Czech-built MiG-17 saw action in the defense of Egypt during the Suez Crisis and were used extensively in both the Yom Kippur and 6 Days War over Israel. Although the superior tactics and better trained pilots of the Israeli Defense Force resulted in the majority of Arab MiGs being destroyed even before they left the ground. Later, the 17 was to play a major role in defending North Vietnamese targets against American bombers. In late 1950, an order was issued for the design of a day fighter that could achieve supersonic speed in level flight. Most research was done in conjunction with the Sagi Flight Research Institute and the Zhukovsky Aerohydrodynamic Institute. New aerodynamic wing shapes were tested using a flying laboratory, and the characteristics of straight, swing, and delta wing designs investigated. The result was the twin-engined I-320 prototype. Its 2-man crew was seated side by side, and its engines were mounted in tandem. Later prototypes incorporated a Tumansky turbojet with a Lushkin liquid propellant rocket engine that could be switched on at takeoff, enabling a much reduced takeoff run. In flight, it could boost speed and altitude. Early flights by test pilot Vashin proved the design could reach the sound barrier. Grigory Sedov was chief test pilot during this exciting period.
In May
1952, we started to explore supersonic flight with a prototype for the MiG-19, the SN-2. But the thrust was not great enough, so first we tried to reach the speed of sound during a dive. In January 1954, after installing more powerful engines with afterburners, we found that we could overcome the sound barrier in horizontal flight. This prototype was called the SN9. It was a very important step for us. The MiG-19 was the first supersonic military fighter aircraft. But for us, it was not just a fighter, it was the way forward to designing further supersonic planes. The designers had many new ideas that were translated onto this plane, without which we would never have reached supersonic speed.
By 1953, the prototypes first flown by Grigory Sedov and later by Konstantin Kokinaki had gone into production as the MiG-19. This aircraft featured two of the Tumansky RD-9B turbojets, each developing a thrust of 7,300 pounds. It had nose-mounted axial compressors and afterburn chambers, which ensured high power-to-weight ratios. Attaining a speed of 900 miles per hour, with its highly swept 58-degree wing, it was not only the Soviets, but the world's first mass-produced supersonic fighter. Various innovations came about during development, including rocket-assisted zero-length takeoff, which could project a MiG-19 to 80 feet and a speed of 150 miles per hour in 3 seconds. Mid-air refueling from Tupolev Tu-4 flying tankers was also developed, using wing-mounted nozzles on the MiG-19 and a nose-mounted cone system on the MiG-15. This considerably increased the range of these aircraft, which were not noted for their fuel efficiency. In the mid-50s, the threat of intercontinental nuclear bombers was seen as so great as to warrant an order for a brand new supersonic high-altitude interceptor. The Mikoyan Bureau departed from the popular swept wing and plumped for a delta design that afforded greater speed and maneuverability, but with a reduction in weight. This new wing overcame the stability and handling problems that had plagued the earlier aircraft. The prototype first flew on the 16th of June, 1956, and was flown by Colonel Likachov in an air display in Moscow a week later.
Скорость машины, которую он сейчас ведет, в 2 раза превышает скорость звука. Потолок более 20 тысяч метров. Еще сложнее выполнять на сверхзвуковых машинах. Потолок более 20 тысяч.
By 1958, test pilot Georgy Masolov had set a new altitude record of 111,500 feet. And Konstantin Kokinaki achieved a world speed record of 1,335 miles per hour, almost 500 miles per hour faster than the MiG-19. Later, Masolov trumped even this with a speed of 1,484 miles per hour. The resulting Mach 2 interceptor, produced from 1960, was designated the MiG-21 and became the most successful and widely used Soviet fighter to date. In numerous variations, it has been delivered to 30 countries worldwide and has set 17 world records. It entered production as a day fighter, powered by an afterburning Tumansky R-11 turbojet, with a system of solid fuel accelerators to reduce takeoff distance and an automatic system of air intake ramps for supersonic flight. It was armed with the Soviets' latest air-to-air missiles and a 30mm cannon. Its greater power and lighter weight gave impetus to the program that was expanding the range of Soviet armaments. Although introduced quite late to the Vietnam conflict, it was used very effectively to down B-52 strategic bombers the purpose for which it had been originally designed. However, the US Air Force had not stood still either, and its F-4 Phantom was a formidable adversary, once again flown by well-trained pilots. Most Chinese and Vietnamese pilots were trained by the Russians, both practically and psychologically. Nguyen Swat was an NVA pilot during the conflict.
I have been flying this plane for 13 years now. For 6 months, between April and October of 1972, I hit 6 American planes. 4 were F-4 Phantoms. By comparison with the Phantom, this plane is superior in terms of its flying characteristics. I testify to it being very good.
A favorite tactic of the North Vietnamese pilots was to use the by now comparatively slow and underarmed MiG-17 as bait to lure the American Phantoms. On engaging the MiG-17s, the Phantoms would suddenly find themselves descended upon by ground-controlled supersonic MiG-21s that would attack and then disappear before any retaliation could be mounted. However, many still found themselves within the sights of a Phantom. The MiG-21 has remained the enduring image of the Cold War skies. The English journal Flying Review calling it the symbol of Russian military power. It was also Artem I. Mikoyan's last design. Even before the MiG-21 went into production, there were plans for an even faster, more powerful interceptor. The design called for an aircraft that would fulfill a multitude of roles. Its operational range needed to be extended. It had to be able to carry greater and heavier warloads. It needed to use larger, more powerful radar that could detect targets at a greater range, all of which meant more powerful but heavier engines. This would mean higher takeoff and landing speeds and longer airstrips. However, the need was still for an aircraft that could operate from the shortest possible unmade airstrips and at the same time achieve supersonic flight. The answer had to be a radical one. The prototype, which saw its first flight tests during the winter of 1966, utilized the then fashionable variable geometry wings. The resulting production aircraft was designated the MiG-23. In contrast to its predecessor, this was a lightweight multi-purpose aircraft. With the wings at a 16-degree angle, it could land and take off from very short, unimproved airfields. In the moderately swept 45-degree angle, it had maximum maneuverability and could engage in dogfights. In the highly swept 72-degree angle, it could reach a maximum speed of 1,553 miles per hour, 250 miles per hour faster than the MiG-21. Entering service in the early 70s, with its infrared homing air-to-air missiles and its powerful high lark look-down radar, probably developed from American units captured during Vietnam, it became the mainstay of the Warsaw Pact air forces throughout that decade, being produced at a rate of 500 per year. It saw action in the Iraq-Iran War, and again in 1982 during the conflict between Syria and Israel, where the faster and more heavily armed MiG-23s suffered heavy losses against the much more agile Israeli Kifers and F-16s. Its prototype was first shown at the Domodedovo Air Show in 1967. It contrasted with the Delta Wing prototype, featuring limited vertical and short takeoff and landing, or V-stall capability, which was used in the later Yakovlev Forger. It was basically a MiG-21 with 2 vertically mounted lift jets, installed in tandem in the center fuselage section. As well as its variable geometry wings, the MiG-23 prototype utilized side-mounted air intakes, leaving more room for internal fuel tanks and better avionics, not least of which could now be mounted in the nose cone. For the first time, it featured a head-up display or HUD system and a laser rangefinder. The MiG-27 was a dedicated air-to-ground derivative of the 23. Entering service in the mid-70s, it was cheaper to produce and was designed specifically for a ground attack role. However, with its bigger engines, it could carry greater warloads. As well as the larger engine, it had additional cockpit armor and a distinctive claw at the wing root. It also featured a head-up display, look-down radar, laser range finding, and self-guided missiles. Utilizing TV imaging equipment, it could attack small, durable ground targets. The MiG-23 and 27 were used successfully in Afghanistan until they came up against the US Stinger shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missile. As well as developing these radical designs, the Bureau, now headed by Belyakov, vowed to push more conventional delta-wing aircraft to their limits. The prototype utilized the successful side-mounted air intakes, but pioneered the use of twin vertical tails to improve directional stability at high angles of attack. On the 5th of October 1967, Mikhail Komarov reached a speed of 1,853 miles per hour, while Alexander Fedotov zoomed to an incredible 123,525 feet. The resulting MiG-25 Foxbat was a long-range, high-altitude Mach 2.8 interceptor, designed to meet the threat of nuclear bombers, particularly the B-58 and XB-70 Valkyrie Mach 3 high-altitude strategic bomber, which the US Air Force was developing but later cancelled. The Foxbat's appearance in the 1970s prompted near hysteria in the West, as its capabilities were greatly speculated and exaggerated upon, probably pushing forward development of the US Air Force's F-15 Eagle. It had valve technology radar, which lacked the sophistication of Western equipment, but offered very high power, and thus the ability to burn through the defenses provided by the enemy's electronic countermeasures. It also benefited from highly organized ground stations that could relay information and commands directly to the cockpit, as well as receiving and analyzing information in return from the aircraft and its missiles. The MiG-25R reconnaissance variant could photograph the whole of Great Britain in one mission. One infamous MiG-25 pilot was Lieutenant Viktor Belenko of PVO Strany, the Soviet Air Defense Command, who on the 6th of September 1976 landed his MiG-25 at Hakodate Civil Airport in northern Japan. The intelligence gained from his defection helped to allay many of the fears and dispel many of the myths that surrounded this formidable aircraft. However, it is still considered the fastest combat aircraft in the world. Later variants have reportedly been tracked on radar over the Sinai Peninsula in Israel at Mach 3.2. MiG-25 record holders include Boris Arlov, who gained the record for the fastest rate of climb, Pyotr Ostapenko, who holds 6 world records, and Svetlana Savitskaya, a female cosmonaut who holds 4 speed and altitude records. The technology needed to push an aircraft this far demanded a new level of Soviet industrial competence. At 3 times the speed of sound, temperatures on an aircraft's fuselage could vary by almost 300 degrees Celsius. This called for new metal alloys to be developed to ever higher tolerances. Measuring, testing, and quality control had to be greatly improved over previous practices. These technologies were used to improve upon the basic MiG-25 design to produce the MiG-31 Foxhound, a ground attack and low-level interceptor derivative of the 25 as the MiG-27 was to the 23. It was ordered as a direct response to the American B-1 bomber, which seemed perfectly capable of overflying the entire Soviet Union with impunity by simply descending below the coverage of ground radar. This made it invisible to traditional short-range interceptors that had relied upon radar information from ground stations to find their targets. Likewise, it was found that F-15s, Tornadoes, and even cruise missiles could quite conceivably attack targets within Russia at low level without being detected. The driving force behind the design of this new aircraft was the need for new technology that could combat this new threat. The basic shape of the MiG-25 was retained because of its superb supersonic capabilities. However, the maximum speed requirement was dropped to Mach 2.4 so that more efficient Tumansky low-silhouette turbojet engines could be used, each with a thrust of 34,171 pounds. The size of its armaments, provision for better avionics, and a 2-man crew drove the size of this aircraft to about that of an F-111. Its on-board data processing and radar technology were a great advance on anything previous. Technology already well established in the West, where it was considered an end in itself, was now being developed in Russia, simply because there was a new threat that had to be countered. The weapon control system consisted of a brand new type of radar, which overcame the drawbacks of traditional systems. Typically, an impulse radar beam would cover about 2 degrees of arc and would be scanned relatively slowly across the sky by a mechanical movement of the radar dish. Using a very stable static radar aerial and mirrors to shift the beam almost instantaneously around the sky, the new system, called Phase Aerial Net, can track multiple targets in different parts of the sky at the same time. Traditional radar on the F-14 could cover an area of 145 square degrees in the process of mechanical scanning. The MiG-31's Phase Aerial Net can scan 20,000 square degrees, most important of which would be the area below the aircraft where low-flying cruise missiles, bombers, or ground attack aircraft would be operating. The cockpit featured an enhanced head-up display system. The weapons control system features an indicator panel displaying missile deployment and readiness. The observer navigator has call-upon tactical situation indicators, control panels for the preparation of weapons, and an extensive set of navigational aids. The phase aerial net system enables targets to be spotted at a distance of 110 miles. At a range of 90 miles, the system can capture, identify, and automatically track up to 10 targets. The 4 most dangerous can be attacked simultaneously with 4 missiles, which are all controlled and guided to their respective targets by the radar system. New air-to-air missiles provide hitting power against high or low altitude targets beyond visual range at speeds of up to 2,300 miles per hour. Communications from ground to air and back, and between separate aircraft, were such that an airborne early warning and defense system against low-flying targets had been successfully created. By the mid-70s, the Mikoyan Bureau was to put all of this new knowledge and technology to the task of giving the Soviet Union a new aircraft that would finally close the gap between East and West. Until now, most MiG designs and much of the Soviet Air Force's strategy had been defensive. The entire third generation of MiG jets, the MiG-21, the 23-27 swing-wing designs, and the 25-31 twin-tail aircraft, had primarily been designed as interceptors, conceived as a defense to the threat of nuclear bombers. The second generation, MiG-15, 17, and 19, had performed well in dogfights over Korea and Vietnam, but were now outdated in terms of aerodynamics, power, and avionics. There was a definite need for a new fourth generation multi-role fighter to compete with the American F-15 Eagle and F-16 Flying Falcon. An aircraft that would primarily perform well in air combat, but with a secondary ground attack role. Handling was to be improved. Acceleration was to be improved 1.5 times. Payload capability was to be improved twofold. And performance at increased angles of attack was to be greatly enhanced. It had to be flexible enough to be deployed from an aircraft carrier and incorporate the latest avionics. Previously, an increase of 10% in flying and fighting capability was considered a great success. This latest advance would require a quantum leap in development, with designers and engineers facing completely new demands in hitherto uncharted areas of development. R.A. Belyakov, who had taken over as chief designer after the retirement of Mikhail Gurievich and the death of Artem Mikoyan in 1970, had stamped his personal mark on the design of the MiG-23 and 25, but knew all too well the pressure that his team was under to continue to perform.
Для того, чтобы создать современный авиационный комплекс на высоком научно-техническом уровне, на уровне лучших
To
мировых
create
образцов,
a flying
нужно, чтобы
complex
его элементы,
that was better than anything else in the world,
были также
all its parts
на
and equipment
соответствующем
should
уровне.
also come up to world
Для этого
standards.
Надо изучать иностранную технику. Надо
To do this,
вести
we should
соревнования
research
и
foreign
сравнения
technology
даже не с
and
лучшими
engineering.
мировыми образцами, а с возможным
We should compete with not only the world's best aircraft, but with the best
развития
aircraft of the future.
соответствующих областей техники. Каждый новый авиационный
Each new
комплекс
design
это
is a
огромная
complex
работа
effort
коллектива
between workers,
конструкторов,
designers and
его,
engineers,
цехов,
design bureaus,
лабораторий,
factories,
летных
laboratories
станций.
and test
Но для
facilities.
ряда
For the chief designer, his deputy and leading engineers, seeing a design go from paper to manufacture is a very long-term project, during which time they are wholly responsible for it.
длинный период работы.
That is why it is very important for people to be able to work well together.
От проектирования до снятия на вооружение.
Over the years of working on the aircraft, we have developed excellent staff.
Поэтому в процессе создания этой техники у нас сколотился замечательный коллектив. Как мы говорим,
We say that there are two big achievements:
нашей работы.
technology and the people who have developed in the process.
И кадры, которые созданы в процессе создания этой техники. Это
Workers,
работники,
designers, test pilots
это летчики,
are all important,
испытатели,
and the
на
success of a
которых,
project
собственно,
depends on them.
Вот вся наша работа создание действительно лучших образцов авиационной техники. В процессе создания
So,
каждого нового
before creating a new aircraft, the staff do all sorts of research, laboratory work, modelling. What makes our bureau special is that we handle everything at all levels within the design period. We are responsible for creating not only fighter bombers, but interceptors and reconnaissance aircraft as well.
И за высокие боевые качества наших самолетов по сложившейся традиции.
We have not only a technical responsibility, but a party responsibility and a moral responsibility. Because we are aware that if we cannot achieve our goals or cannot do better than our foreign competitors, no one else can or is capable of doing so in this country.
И опыту работы. Наш коллектив отвечает за создание фронтовой авиации.
The result of all this effort, the prototype that was to become the MiG-29 Fulcrum, obviously met with great approval as Valery Manitsky displayed its flying capabilities to Leonid Brezhnev as early as October 1977. The design owed much to the high-speed MiG-25 Foxbat, with its twin engines and twin tails. But to achieve new goals, radical solutions had been found. Traditionally, components of the aircraft had always been treated separately. The fuselage housed the cockpit, engines and avionics. The wings provided aerodynamic lift, and the tail provided horizontal and vertical stability. In order to achieve maximum lift and maneuverability, the team moved towards a fully integrated design where all the components contributed to aerodynamic lift. It allowed the development of a minimal frontal drag profile, whilst maximizing the volume in which to locate its major equipment. The body at the front of the aircraft took on the shape of a thick wing profile, with the Lex wing root extensions beneath the cockpit greatly improving stability and maneuverability. At high angles of attack, the Lex shed vortexes over the top of the wing, thus maintaining airflow and reducing wingtip stall. Design and construction took into account the latest Western technology, with many parts being made of composite materials, where the major component was carbon fiber. Joints were made from highest purity aluminium, steel, and titanium, with many internal structures comprising honeycomb sections for maximum strength with minimum weight. The canopy was designed for minimum drag, whilst affording the widest possible visibility. No one engine could meet the desired brief, so a brand new turbofan engine was designed. Two of these Tumansky RD-33 engines, each developing 35,000 pounds of thrust, were incorporated into the MiG-29's design, giving it a maximum speed of Mach 2.3 and a maximum takeoff weight of 40,000 pounds, enabling it to carry virtually all of the Soviets' current armaments at any speed, any altitude, and at any angle. With external drop tanks, the operational range exceeded 1,300 miles. Early testing by Takhtar Abubakirov at high angles of attack proved that the right decisions had been made, and to some extent the actual flight characteristics proved better than theoretical design figures had predicted. Improvement was an ongoing concern, and throughout the 80s, development continued. By the late 80s, testing was well underway for a Navy version that could fly from the new Tbilisi-class aircraft carriers. Alexei Fedotov, a MiG test pilot for many years, praised the flying characteristics of this new generation jet as a new generation of test pilots, such as Gavrilovich Fastovets and Takhtar Abubakirov, continued his work. These airfield-based ram tests were soon to be followed by carrier-based testing. Contrary to the West's expectations, the cockpit featured a very conventional control system, which, although lacking the sophistication of a fly-by-wire computerized system, did have the advantage of being very familiar to the vast majority of the existing MiG pilots.
This aircraft is beyond comparison with any other. It is very easy to fly. Personally, I was retrained to fly it without very much preliminary training at all and without flying in anything very similar. I have experienced no difficulties at all, and it is especially easy to land. I didn't experience the difficulties of conversion, which typified the previous types of fighters, such as the MiG-21 and MiG-23. It fully meets its flight objectives.
The weapon system consists of 3 target-seeking channels: a radar station that can detect targets at a distance of 60 miles, an infrared detector and laser range finder that works at medium range, and a sighting device in the pilot's helmet that works for targets within visual range. All these systems interact through a sophisticated computer system which controls all of the armaments. The radar sighting system, developed from that in the MiG-31, is used to pinpoint and track up to 10 targets against terrestrial and sky backgrounds. It can also track targets flying along converging and parallel courses, as well as picking up specific targets maneuvering through Doppler frequencies alongside routes. Such a tracking pattern is necessary to effect a sudden surprise attack. It can engage enemy aircraft at a distance of 30 to 40 miles, knocking them down with the AA-10 beyond visual range radar-guided air-to-air missile. The Coles Quantum Optical Radar Unit enables detection of targets through an infrared heat-seeking channel and a laser rangefinder. Once the target has been pinpointed by the heat seeker, the laser rangefinder comes into operation. The heat seeker can detect targets flying in the rear hemisphere behind the aircraft at a distance of up to 10 miles. The laser can then measure the range to an accuracy of between 1,000 and 13,000 feet. The whole system can lock onto a visible target in 2 seconds. This system overcomes the problems of electronic radio interference that can hamper traditional radar systems. The Coles system also increases the accuracy of the MiG's 30mm cannon located in the left-hand wing root extension. The Cole system relays the complex information on angular coordinates, target range and angular velocity taken from a highly maneuvering opponent in a dogfight to the weapon system computer, which uses computational algorithms to predict where a target will be at any time. It can also accurately predict maneuvering intensity and specific G-loads, and generally requires a maximum of only 5 to 7 rounds of ammunition to destroy a target. Finally, the helmet-mounted target acquisition system relays all essential data to short-range missile, Coles and radar systems. The pilot merely has to turn his head and catch the target in the helmet sights, and the appropriate system will lock onto the enemy aircraft. The armament consists of a maximum of 6 air-to-air guided missiles and the 30mm cannon with 150 rounds firing at a rate of 1,800 rounds per minute. It can also carry bombs slung onto its external stores, as well as standard 57.8 or 240mm rocket projectiles. The Mikoyan design team could breathe a sigh of relief as the result of 10 years' work was applauded by critics throughout the world, not least of which was the Soviet military hierarchy.
Самолет МиГ-29 имеет очень мощное вооружение.
The MiG-29 has a very powerful weapons system and very good flight characteristics, and also, very importantly, it is very easy to fly. It is our opinion that there is no other aircraft existing in the world that can match it. If we compare foreign-made aircraft in the same class, they show up very poorly or less well when compared to the MiG-29. I have to say that it is the pride of our industry and that our chief designers worked very hard and produced an excellent plane.
Undoubtedly, the MiG-29 represents a quantum leap for Soviet aviation and proves without a doubt that Soviet military technology, philosophy and ingenuity equals that of the West. However, in an ever-changing world, the massive upheavals in the Soviet Union mean that the Mikoyan Bureau now has to face a much sterner critic, that of the open market. With the breakup of the old Soviet Union, the design bureaus are struggling to find their way in a new market economy and a new world order. Without the massive state assistance that they once had, and without many of their traditional buyers, as many Eastern Bloc countries move away from Soviet dominance. If the bureau survived, the MiG-29 could herald the dawning of a new era in aircraft technology, with a whole new generation of Russian combat aircraft building on the decades of innovative design, but also benefiting from Western technological advances in the free exchange of ideas that has developed since Glasnost. Or, if they don't survive, then the MiG-29 could stand as a memorial to the greatest and most influential Russian design bureau, the last great Soviet combat aircraft, the last MiG.
The aircraft had completed their manoeuvres, it seemed, and that they were joining up, perhaps to circuit and then land. And as one aircraft joined the other, they touched, and the lower of the two aircraft appeared to break up almost immediately. The second aircraft climbed up sharply to the left, and there seemed to be a measure of control, but then it too began to break up, and fire broke out. By that time, the first aircraft had gone down. There was a pall of black smoke. We saw two parachutes. We believe that they were both single-seaters, and therefore both pilots had banged out. I don't think the Russians would ever send pilots anywhere around the world who couldn't be relied upon to do a professional job, and that's just what they were doing.